Alright, so the last time I reviewed a Hyundai, it was the Staria, and let's just say I thought it needed a little bit more polish. It was a good van nonetheless, but just a few more bits to make it that little bit better. So it's take two for me with another Hyundai, and this time around it's with their smallest crossover, the Creta. We'll kick off first with the most important bit, the driving impressions. Now, I've had the Creta for a couple of days already, drove it in a variety of road conditions from standstill traffic to where we are right now, the expressway. Now, around the city, the Creta is actually very light to drive. The electronic power steering does a very good job of that. Sure, it doesn't give you much feel or feedback, but as a city car, it's actually pretty good. And the small size helps too. As for the highway experience in the Creta, here's something you have to know. It has advanced driver assist systems. Now it has lane keeping assist, it has steering assist, it's got blind spot warning, blind spot monitoring, and so on and so forth. What it doesn't have is adaptive cruise control. So the ride, comfortable at the front, a little bit firm at the back, but I do have to say something about the seats. Now, perhaps this is the first time I'm complaining about seats that are being too soft. The trouble is, it doesn't have lumbar support. So what happens is, as the miles pile on and the hours and etc., you start sinking into the seat, and because there's not much lumbar support, all of that pressure kind of goes to your lower back. And I felt this when I was stuck in traffic for 4 hours a couple of days back. Now, performance-wise, it's got a 1.5-liter engine with 113 or so horsepower and 144 Newton meters of torque. If those specs sound familiar, that's because the Creta uses the exact same engine as the Stargazer. Typical 1.5-liter engine. It's not the fastest thing in the world, but I do have to commend its smoothness, and more especially its efficiency. Out on the highway, I got as much as 17.5 kilometers per liter, and that included a fair bit of overtaking. But more praises go to the transmission. Now, yes, it is a CVT, or in Hyundai Kia speak, it is an IVT. You don't get that rubber bandy feel or that laggy feel you usually get with a CVT, and it is fairly responsive too. Now, in the city, it's been terrible in terms of volume and the conditions and etc. But the Creta still manages to return about 8.4, 8.6 kilometers per liter. For mixed conditions, you're looking at about 12 to 13 kilometers per liter, depending on if you do more highway miles or if you do more city miles. But all in all, the Creta is a hugely efficient vehicle. There are driving modes available. Right now I am on eco mode because, well, we are on the highway, we're just cruising. Nothing really sporty or dynamic or extreme, but I can switch it back to normal, or I can put it in sport mode. And while you're touring around these modes, there are also traction modes. So you press the button and you're greeted by snow, mud, or sand. Now, don't fall under the impression though that this is all-wheel drive. This is still a two-wheel drive vehicle. It's front-wheel drive to be specific. This sort of just helps the traction control and stability control in certain conditions. We really don't recommend taking this thing to the trails just because it has those modes. But it is nice to have in case you suddenly think of, I'm gonna drive down the beach today. So driving impressions over, what about the interior? So let's start off with the headroom, and mind you, this is in my seating position and this is jacked up all the way to its highest setting because I'm not that tall. I still have about this headroom left. Now the steering wheel, it is leather wrapped, but when you touch it, it doesn't feel like leather at all. It doesn't even feel like vegan leather. At some point you could probably call it vinyl, but yeah, it is what it is. You do get stitching though, so that kind of makes it look fancy, I guess. And then onto the center console, you get a pretty big screen here. It does have Apple CarPlay, it does have Android Auto, and it is wireless. The screen itself is actually pretty easy to use. Now moving down to the climate control system, it's simple, it's straightforward, it's a single zone unit. Moving down, you got a pair of USB ports. One is for your USB, and you have your standard charger as well. Now below this, yes, it looks like a rubberized pad, but it's actually the wireless charger. Now for the cabin design, well, I think it looks good. You know, it's got a nice contrasting color, it's brown on black. Aesthetics aside, the moment you start touching it, that's where it kind of starts falling apart. Not literally, okay, but you thought that, you know, because it looks good, it probably feels good, but that's not the case in the Creta. Got a pair of cup holders. There's also the storage bin here, although it's really not that big. So that's the impression of the front end of the cabin. What about over at the back? Okay, so for the back seats, which is kind of important for this sort of class of car because this is also used as a family car. So anyway, again, we start with headroom, and I still have about this much. Now for legroom, now the seat is in my position, and assuming you are carrying 5'3" passengers in here, it's gonna be fine. Now moving from the legroom and near room, I noticed that it's got AC vents here at the back, and that's a good thing because it is blazing hot right now in the country. And just below it, you have a neat little storage bin and a USB port. And I also noticed something, and something I haven't seen in quite some time. When was the last time you saw a lap belt for the center passenger? Anyway, the armrest, right. It is, well, it's your typical armrest, although it's nice of them to add 2 cup holders along for the ride. Now, as for visibility, well, the belt line's pretty high up, so if you have kids, they're probably gonna feel a little bit claustrophobic, but thankfully the windows roll all the way down, which is nice. Now, the cargo area is actually a nice square shape, and it's actually fairly long for a subcompact crossover, so you can load in a fair amount of stuff inside. And there are also bins on each side of the cargo area, so if you have valuables or items that kind of roll around a bit, you can just stick them on the sides. Now, I did notice that the cargo floor is a bit high, and that does kind of eat up cargo space, but the reason for that is this. It actually has a full-size spare wheel, and it's exactly the same size as the ones, well, attached to the axles right now. It's 215/60R17. And here's another interesting thing. The rim is actually a 17-inch Steely, so this is probably one of the biggest Steelies I've ever seen. Any complaints? Well, there's the lack of the cargo cover, and that's pretty much it. So if you're gonna park in an area that's kind of sketchy, just do watch out for your valuables because, again, you don't have any protection whatsoever if you're gonna put valuables at the back of the Creta. Better yet, just bring your valuables along. And now for the exterior, and a couple of things you have to know about the Creta. It's a little over 4.3 meters long, it's less than 1.8 meters wide, and a little over 1.6 meters tall. So it'll easily fit in most garages. As for the design, well, it's a mix of baby Tucson, and it's got a couple of its own styling quirks here and there. Now, let's start off with the side, and you're gonna notice those deep character marks on the doors and on the fenders. Now, that gives the Creta a sort of chunkier look. It makes it look beefier than it actually is. And at the same time, you also get more character lines down the bottom. It doesn't quite get the same slashy angles as you see in the Tucson, but you know, it works well for the Creta. Now, you're also going to notice the two-tone design here, and that's for the top-spec GLS variant. It also gives off the impression of a floating roof design of sorts, because they blacked out the pillars right at the front and right at the back. Now, the two-tone, it's either you like it or you don't, but I think it adds a little bit more character to the already quirky styling of the Creta. Now, moving to the wheels, well, it's actually a bit of an optical illusion here because they look beefy and chunky, but they're actually 17-inch alloys wrapped around 60 series profile tires. See what I mean about it looking like a baby Tucson? Now, the grille pattern is identical to its bigger brother, and these lights as well. Now, speaking of these lights, these are not the main beams. These are the main beams. As for the rest of the Creta's front end, you get a clamshell style hood, And these pillars, they kind of just stick out from the fenders. I kind of like that actually, because it gives it a tall glass house, at least at the front, and you also get this huge windshield. And the reason why I like a huge windshield is I can see a lot more of what's ahead of me. The rear end of the Creta is perhaps the most talked about bit of this crossover, and we can't blame you for that, because just look at this whole taillight. You got this red strip up here, you got a reflector down here, and then you have the whole cluster right down here. And your reverse lights are all the way on the bumpers. Now, even the tailgate has its own share of quirks. Now, just take a look at the number of character lines you see on this panel. So you have one right below the rear windshield, got this crease right here, and then it kicks back in, and then it juts back out again, right in the middle of the tailgate, and then it kicks back in again, and then it goes back out again. Then you have another character line down here for the lip of the tailgate. Now, I will admit there's a lot going on in this tailgate, but again, Hyundai's goal is to stand out in the crowded subcompact crossover class. But if there are two features that most people will like rather than be split on it 50-50, it would have to be the tailgate spoiler design and the rear shark fin. Now, we normally just say, okay, that's got a rear shark fin, but the way it's integrated into that sort of curved roof line and just merges into the tailgate, we think that's pretty neat, and it makes the roof look longer than it actually is. Well, what do we think of the Hyundai Creta? What's the verdict on Hyundai's smallest crossover? Let's start off with the pros, the good news first. Now, I have to put design as a pro because, well, again, whether you like it or not, it's unique, it's different, it's funky in some ways, and it's definitely not boring. The second would be the fuel efficiency. Now, you don't even have to try hard to get good gas mileage out of this thing. I mean, on the highway, it's practically doing diesel fuel economy, and in the city, it's actually still fine, even in heavy traffic. Another pro would be the transmission, because it doesn't really feel like a CVT at all, despite being a CVT essentially. And let's not forget that this is still a family car in essence, so that huge cargo space is a huge benefit for those looking for a small crossover. Of course, no car is perfect, and obviously the Creta is no exception to that. One of my cons would be the ride. Yes, it's great at the front, but once you start putting passengers at the back, it starts to feel a little bit crashy over there. And then there are the seats. Now, the seats, really, you're gonna spend a lot of time in this car, a lot of time in traffic or in road trips or other drives, and the fact that it just lacks that bit of lumbar support sort of just negates any comfort gains that the front suspension has to offer, because you just sink into them. And I would suggest that for the minor model change of this one, to come with slightly firmer seats or at least extra lumbar support. I also had a moan about the Creta's Apple CarPlay and Android Auto system, particularly its wireless system. Now, apart from it being glitchy and it crashed on me a couple of times, well, the fact that you have to hook it up to Bluetooth sort of negates the purpose of having Apple CarPlay in the first place. That said, you do have the option of directly porting Android Auto with your cable. But why stop there? Why not include Apple? And last is the interior materials. It's sort of like the Staria all over again. It looks great, but the moment you start touching things, that's where it sort of starts falling apart. Not literally, but figuratively rather. Another con of this would be the price, and it's sort of attached to the whole interior feel of this, because the Creta retails for 1,388,000 pesos, and that puts it right in the line of fire of two very popular Japanese subcompact crossovers, the Honda HR-V and the Toyota Corolla Cross, the non-hybrid version. Now, this car is just 1,000 pesos less than the Honda HR-V. And because of that, I'm gonna have to give the Creta the same score as the Staria, which is a 7 out of 10.